everyone. We'd like to welcome you to our webinar today on selecting a hosting method for your QMS, on-premise versus SaaS, key considerations for quality professionals. My name is Christine Snickenbooley, and I'm the Customer Service Manager here at Doxalent. We have two fantastic presenters today from our Doxalent team. Our first presenter is Amy Rodriguez, who is our Chief Operating Officer. And we also have Chad Booley, who is our Director of Technology. If you have any questions at all during today's webinar, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat and our presenters will answer them towards the end of the presentation as time allows. Without further ado, let's get started.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you walk away today learning some nuggets of information to help you assess your current situation, as well as make some more informed decisions in the future, should you be looking for your first QMS, or if you're looking to potentially change your QMS vendor in the upcoming future. Now, potentially, if you change vendors, you may be looking to change hosting models. We see this frequently with our customers where they may be on-premise now, but looking for the best right fit solution for them when they make the next change. Chad and I have been working with quality professionals and their IT teams for a decade each. Sad to say that, seems like a very long time. So we've come up with some thought-provoking decision points that we want to be sharing with you today. The intent is to collaborate with your IT teams on the answers to the questions that we pose. You will likely not know all the answers to the questions that we're suggesting all by yourself. And let me just say, I'm really glad that we have a whole hour to dive deep into this topic, as I'm usually asked to help customers weigh this decision framework in a very brief presentation and conversation. And you'll see, we have a lot to tell you today. First, if you told me 10 years ago that we'd still be talking about on-premise, I'd have chuckled a little bit. But surprisingly, about 35% of businesses still opt for on-premise solutions. And that's why today, late in 2025, we're still discussing how to make the best decision for your business. Today, what we're going to cover, the agenda. Understanding SaaS and on-prem deployments. And SaaS is actually two different models, not just one. Adoption trends and where the market is headed. Some decision factors. There are 8 key decision factors that Chad will dive deep into. A few real-world case studies. And then a decision framework for some other business characteristics, so to say, that really dive into specific scenarios that you may have in your business. Let's understand these deployment models. Surprise, again, there's not 2, but there's 3. First one, very obvious, on-premise. This is company managed and is either behind the firewall or in a private cloud. We get asked a lot, will we use Azure or we use AWS? If the vendor is not actually hosting the data and it is in your cloud run by your team, even if it is one of those large vendors that are in the cloud, it is still considered to be on-premise. It is not vendor managed. The next one, cloud-based SaaS. This is vendor managed, subscription-based cloud platform managed by the vendor. And the key aspect is shared infrastructure in an application instance. Chad and I also refer to this as a traditional SaaS model. The third model is web-based SaaS. Vendor managed, subscription-based cloud, just like cloud-based SaaS, but it may not be shared infrastructure. It may be unique to your separate installation, or it may be shared in some sort of pod architecture. The key point here for this conversation is assume it is a single application installation. So you will not share the software just through a security model with other customers. So cloud-based, web-based. As we go through today's presentation, you will see that we are always going to discuss the difference between on-premise or SaaS. For some of the key criteria, we're going to break it down further into cloud-based or web-based because there are different facets of both when it is considered to be single instance versus the shared instance. Now, what I want you to think about as we go through today's scenario is, what are you today? Do you have an on-premise QMS? Do you have a cloud-based SaaS QMS, a web-based SaaS QMS, or do you have no QMS, which means you're just using paper, spreadsheets, SharePoint, etc. And really, as we say QMS, we really mean wherever you do your document control and training, your quality management, your specification management, everything that really would encompass a QMS, but for simplicity, we're calling it a QMS. So think about who you are today. If you're not sure, go ahead and use that Q&A and our team will help you figure out what you likely are today so that you can really think about, what am I now? is my mind changed, or do I have a lot of food for thought from today's presentation? Let's talk about some adoption trends, just to give you more meat for why you're here today and why we're discussing this topic. So in the last 10 years, from 2014 to 2024, on-premise has shifted from 70 to 80% to about 30 to 40%. So a fairly steep decline, but this has been over 10 years. SaaS obviously flipped into the opposite. It went from 20 to 30% 10 years ago to 55 to 70% now. If we look at 2024 specifically, talking about SaaS, what is the breakdown between web-based and cloud-based? So about 60% of cloud-based, so that is that shared instance. About 40% are web-based, so that single instance installation. This one was actually surprising to me because we didn't think that many people offered web-based, but as you walk through today's scenarios, you'll understand why it is still a very popular offering, particularly for QMSs, where maybe not quite so popular for other software applications that are much more lightweight, less users, less mission critical for the businesses. Chad and I looked at this data and said, I wonder if 2020 actually had a much more significant impact on that because companies had more remote work staff. Cloud first was really something we would hear a lot more often in 2019, which is where IT staff selecting all new applications were really leaning towards SaaS versus leaning towards on-premise. We do see that there was a relatively sharper spike between 2019 and 2020, but it's not an extreme spike, and it just continued to proceed until that flip happened between 2022 and 2023, where SaaS became the more predominant offering compared to on-premise. Now, in this data is really rough data. What I do suspect is it's not about necessarily what people are picking now, but also what just frankly people have now. And what we find is that legacy on-premise systems tend to have a lot of stickiness. People don't change their QMS very often. They tend to identify an option and stick with it for a very long time unless their business outgrows the current solution, or there's new management, they were purchased, they need to make a different solution, in which case they may not only change vendors, but they may change their hosting method. So a lot of these on-premise, I suspect, aren't necessarily new, but they may also be legacy. It just so happens that they still have that on-premise solution because people don't change that often in this market. Some industry-specific marketing trends. Taking a peek at manufacturing. We have a lot of manufacturing customers, so I was curious where this number would pan out. 36% of all QMS deployments are manufacturing overall, and they have slightly slower SaaS adoption. Now, why? Is this because the nature of in-house employees on the shop floor, so they feel more comfortable having an on-premise solution behind the firewall? They're nervous about internet connectivity. It could be that they're traditional businesses that are simply slow adopters. If you have a theory, go ahead and put it in Q&A, and we would love to hear it. Next, small to medium businesses. 70% of them prefer SaaS. Why? Faster setup, lower overhead. Small to medium business nowadays tend to not even have IT staff. They outsource their IT staff to third parties so they can handle things like laptops and application deployments. So they don't want to have the staff in-house to manage new applications, new infrastructure. They would rather have it all be handled by SaaS. It allows small companies to keep that IT team nice, efficient, small, and nimble. Lastly, pharmaceuticals, consumer health, other ancillary, highly regulated industries, real traditional industries, they tend to be almost the opposite. About 58% of them were on-premise as of 2024. I also suspect that this is what I mentioned in the previous slide, that legacy on-premise installations stick around for a really long time. It also takes a really long time to implement a QMS for a large regulated industry. So they tend to have more stickiness, and those big pharma companies also have large IT teams that they've had for a long time. So once they are on premise, they then stick with on premise. So I suspect that's one of the reasons why this number is so much higher than the average of 35% on premise in 2024. Now, where are we going in the next 5 years? So in the next 5 years, we expect SaaS to exceed 70 to 75% of deployments. So not really the 95% that I would have anticipated 10 years ago over the next 15-year span, but it is going to continue to grow and be prevalent as people on board with the QMS for the first time or potentially make switches. Now, again, on-premise is still going to remain an option for pharma, other highly regulated industries such as aerospace and defense sectors. They have specific security requirements that not all vendors can support, and it's simply easier because they have large teams dedicated to understanding the requirements by which they need to follow. Let's talk about a few quotes. We reached out to the internet and tried to find some quotes that support on-premise or SaaS. There were far more that supported SaaS, not surprisingly, because it really is the trend across all industries, not just QMS. But one that I liked and found about on-premise, these benefits make on-prem deployment particularly attractive for organizations in highly regulated industries or those handling sensitive data, providing the control and security necessary to meet specific compliance requirements. This was from Cyber Defense Magazine. For SaaS quotes, there were a plethora of them. One that we really enjoyed was the next one. I'm going to actually hand this over to Chad because when Chad saw this metaphor, he actually added his own little quip to it, which I think was really amusing. So perfect transition to my colleague.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so I'll just go ahead first and read the quote to you so you see what I'm talking about. So with SaaS, it's like joining a gym. You access modern equipment and facilities without having to buy, maintain, or repair anything. You focus on your workout, not the operations, which is fantastic in theory. One of the challenges, I don't know if many of you have been to a gym recently or perhaps a hotel gym. However, I don't know that I've ever been to a hotel gym where there isn't lots of broken equipment. So I hope this analogy for SaaS is doing SaaS a disservice. And I would recommend that all of you make sure that it's like a fancy gym and not like a local Bob's Discount gym. So where we want to kind of go today, we want to talk about some of the key decision factors and how we can help you guide your evaluation of a QMS. So here we're going to get going here. I like to walk through some key factors to consider when choosing how to host your QMS. Whether you're considering cloud SaaS, web SaaS, and on-premise, which Amy explained those out to you clearly before, each decision point can help shape accessibility, the flexibility, the compliance, and ultimately how well your system supports your organization's goals. So these topics will help frame a practical way for you to evaluate and weigh out all of your options moving forward. So I want to first start talking about the global and remote third-party access needs. So essentially, who are the users that are going to be using your QMS? And I'd like to start first by asking you to pose some of these questions to yourself, to your internal teams, to understand who is your user base. So first question, who are the users? Are they internal, external contractors? Are they partners? Who's going to need access to your QMS? Do you expect users to change frequently? So are they suppliers? Are they seasonal workers? How easily can you onboard and offboard them? Will any users require special compliance validation or controlled access due to local regulations? Are users going to be globally distributed or concentrated into specific regions? Are there regulatory or contractual requirements for data residency or regional access controls? And that's a really important one that I'm going to touch on a little bit later. Will remote or traveling employees and suppliers need reliable access outside of their primary office network? How are users going to connect? Do they have capabilities? What are their capabilities? How limited are they? Is it going to be browser-based access? Do they require a VPN? Is a remote desktop connection needed? Is it a web application? So there's a lot of kind of technical considerations there. And do we have internal resources whom are responsible for onboarding, support, and troubleshooting and access issues, all the fun stuff associated with tons and tons of users? So these are the kind of the main thoughts that you kind of need to think about before you start approaching the subject matter of deployment methodologies. So I'm going to go through each of the deployment methodologies now, and I want to think about the who, where, and the how specifically around them. So let's consider on-premise. So generally, what is the who and the where for an on-premise application? It's usually a local, regional type staff. You may have a couple of network or a couple of locations, physical office locations in a regionalized area. You probably have a VPN Active Directory set up, and you connect into your essentially your two offices are connected via VPN, and you authenticate to your application via Active Directory. That's pretty standard for the who and the where. And the how in that case is obviously using Active Directory for your authentication methodologies. With SaaS methodologies in general, the preferred method is not going to be a VPN connection in Active Directory. There are definite technical challenges with VPNs, especially when you're connecting to servers that aren't managed by you. So that is not the preferred methodology for connection. When you're talking about a SaaS model, most likely you're going to want to err to using single sign-on. That is preferred by all SaaS vendors in general, and some vendors that offer you both the QMS as well as the hosting will offer you some sort of local authentication within their application. But now consider your user base. So are all of your users in the same location? Are they going to be able to access all using SSO? Do all of them on the same Active Directory domains? If they're on different domains, is your IT team going to be able to support that if it's in an on-premise model? Are you globally distributed? If you're globally distributed and you're going to need all hours access to everything, does it make sense for you to have an on-premise installation where your support staff only works 9 to 5 in a certain region? So there's these types of things. When you understand where your user is connecting from, what times of day they're actually going to be online and working, it's going to help you answer these questions. So by asking who are your users, where they're coming from, how they're going to connect, you're going to be able to zero in on the deployment model that truly meets your QMS requirements. Now I'd like to talk about some customization options, but first let's consider what actually are the endpoints for the customization in general for QMS. So these are things like SAP, which is an ERP system. You may be using a manufacturing execution system, potentially product lifecycle management, a CRM, maybe even human resources or information systems. So that's kind of the most popular integration systems that we see for QMS. Now, but we also need to think about what are the ways that we can connect these two systems together. So what are the methodologies involved? Well, one of the more popular ones, obviously, these days is an API-based integration, whether that's a REST or a SOAP API, or potentially even using webhooks. Another common one is a flat file exchange, whether that's CSV, XML, or even text files. You also have database-to-database connections. And in some cases, you'll have middleware or some sort of integration platform. So if you think about integrations, you need to consider two things. Now, number one, how are you going to support them? Number two, do we have the chops in house to handle our side of an integration? Is the integration from the vendor going to be completely out of the box? So let's dive into by deployment model and consider each. So obviously in the on-premise world, it's kind of the gold standard for backend access, right? You're going to be able to fully manage your integrations, and even legacy environments are much easier to accommodate, right? New customization options, upgrades, integrations could get stuck in IT backlog if the IP backlog resources are thin. And again, this is one of the things that's going to keep coming up is in larger companies, you're going to have to sit in a queue for your projects in an on-premise world. Now, in smaller companies, you may not have that issue, but you also may have an issue with know-how and technical chops. So it also depends on what type of QMS you have, right? What type of integration you want to move forward with. If it's an API-based integration, do you have the development in-house to be able to help code your side of the API integration? Lots of considerations there. On-premise, though, your development and testing is going to be probably some of the best, right? You have all of the flexibility that you need to do as much testing or as little testing as you'd like. You can take as long as you want or be as fast as you want. That is entirely up to you. One cautionary tale, though, when it comes to customization in an on-premise world is make sure you're very in tune with what the terms of service are for your support agreements. And I say that because I've seen a lot of times you'll have an overzealous subject matter expert at an on-premise situation, and they take advantage of their ability to learn how to learn database schema, and they'll make some modifications and things. Then all of a sudden, we're not able to support them, or your vendor's struggling to be able to answer questions that make sense to you and your users because nothing's adding up. So make sure you're paying attention to your terms of service and you understand exactly what's in your agreements before you kind of move down that road. But it's extremely flexible. Now, when you come to the cloud SaaS model, you're really talking about more of a commercial off the shelf. Now, that's not to say that they don't offer integrations. And of course, customization probably is available through your standard settings within the user interface of the application itself. However, when you're talking about an integration like an API integration to an SAP, it's probably just going to be the standard off the shelf, right? Your team is going to need to be able to understand how to code for that API and make those calls, but those integrations are off the shelf. They're not customized. They're not unique to you. You probably won't be able to get into the development pipeline for new calls to be created. So it's something to consider. Development and testing of these custom integrations is probably going to be a pain point, because if they are complex from your side and they do require testing, it's going to take some time for you guys to go through that. And the amount of time that you have, the amount of access to your staging environment, whether or not you have a staging environment, it's possible that you may have to pay a little bit extra specifically for a staging environment. These are all options that you have to consider. They're things that are probably on the table, but understanding that what your requirements are from the integration piece of things is going to make all the difference in the world when helping you decide what deployment models for you. Web SaaS, you're going to find yourselves having a lot more flexibility, really, with a web SaaS model, specifically around things like custom integration types. So API is a big thing for cloud SaaS, but web SaaS is going to give you a lot more options, specifically because you're also very isolated, right? The single instance is a huge use case for having like a flat file exchange. So you can have flat files being transferred on a server. You can have FTP set up, all that fun stuff. You can do a lot of different things, and I feel like you have a lot more security around it too, because you're the only one. You're not being commingled on a box. Again, with web SaaS, the development testing, you're going to have a lot more options for testing. Now, keep in mind that the upgrade process, which is going to come up on the next slide, I'm not there yet though. The upgrade process is going to be a little bit more rigid in your cloud SaaS world versus your web SaaS world. So you're going to have the luxury of time for testing out your integrations. You may not have issues with things breaking on releases because you don't have to take every single release. So your testing can be a little bit more regimented with your integrations. Specifically, you can plan them out better. You can schedule your resources. So what you'll be seeing in a lot of these slides is there's a trade-off between control, flexibility, and then ease of use and budgeting, right? So that's really, with every single slide, that's kind of the main theme. So understanding where you have resources that can accommodate and whether or not you're willing to accommodate them for this particular purpose. So in a nutshell, on this page, understanding which business systems you need to connect, whether it's an ERP, an MES, or a PLM, and how you plan to integrate them, whether it's through APIs, flat files, or database links. It's going to help you choose the QMS deployment that fits your technical requirements and your capacity for supporting them. Upgrade strategy. So upgrade strategy is, upgrading is like, it's a 4-letter word, really. Nobody likes to upgrade. It's sometimes going to be painful. However, let's talk about some of the considerations you need to have in the on-prem world or in any of these worlds when you're considering to take an upgrade or being forced to take one. Do you require advanced time to train your users? New features before an upgrade goes live. It's kind of a big deal. Can upgrades in testing be scheduled during off hours to minimize disruption? How much time should be allocated for thorough validation and risk assessment of changes in the dev and test environments? Is there sufficient allowance for user acceptance testing before pushing updates to production? And who's going to coordinate this? Does the chosen model let the organization control timing and the sequence of upgrades? Do I have to take every upgrade? You don't know. You got to figure that one out. Or do none of these concerns apply to you? I'd be surprised if that were the case. So again, on premise, right, you have full control of the upgrade process and how often you apply new patches and new versions. So this model is going to support, your rigorous testing efforts. You can, the customization of validation efforts, downtime planning on your terms. Obviously, the trade-off is that it's a much greater IT burden. for monitoring, executing, and supporting these upgrades. Plus, you add in risk if critical patches to the QMS system are missed or delayed. Likewise for even the server architecture as well. In the cloud SaaS model, you're going to get automatic updates delivered to you on a vendor-driven schedule. And vendor-driven schedule really is the key there. You're not going to have a lot of influence into when these things come your way. So you're going to be on top of all the latest security updates and patches, so you won't be behind the 8 ball there. But you also may get new features that you aren't ready for. So it's something to consider. What is your tolerance for this specifically? And then in web SaaS is kind of the best of both worlds. And there's a good distinction here to make, which is given that in a lot of times you are on a single instance, or like Amy said, a pod type architecture where you have a limited amount of people where you're commingling, you're going to have more influence into what upgrades you're taking. And specifically when you have separate front end instances of your application, not everything on the same server is going to have the same version. So you're going to have that flexibility. You can control the timelines and how long things sit in your test environment. When you are ready to complete your validation work and go to production, that's your call. You won't be behind the 8 ball on your paperwork. You'll be able to make sure that you get it done prior to everything going in production. So there's some definite key value points there that you're going to want to consider. It takes all of the hard work out of the actual upgrade process from your IT staff. And it just basically allows you to take some of that control back, but also not having to carry all of the burden. So considering a thoughtful upgrade strategy means asking whether the deployment model supports advanced user training, which is key, off-hour scheduling, thorough validation in UAT, and whether upgrade timing is controlled by the organization or the vendor. So updates can be managed with minimal business disruption and optimal readiness for your team. Risk and resilient planning. So what does this mean? The most important thing you can do for your QMS is to decide how important is my QMS to me. So this really ties into business continuity. So when you consider your QMS, what is your tolerance for outages? And do you and you, I say you as in the business, the users of the QMS and the IT team, are you in agreement with this importance level? So internally, we use something we call something a key business system, and we basically rate all of our systems that we use, and then based on the rating, we understand exactly what we're going to require for business continuity. So if you're not familiar with it, I'll go into it briefly, but a business continuity and a disaster recovery plan is something that you're going to want to have in place. If your QMS is considered to be a mission critical type application, then you're going to want to have it documented what you're going to do in the event of an outage. And so the key thing to think about is what is the time frame that you're going to allow the QMS to actually be down. So is that, well, let's just say it's 7 days, right? You can live without your QMS for 7 days. Okay, now you have that number, so you know how to go to a vendor, you go to your IT team, you go to your SaaS vendor, and you basically ask the question, what is the plan for restoration? What is the plan for back the recovery of my system? Are you able to meet my 7-day requirement? And the answer needs to be yes, because that is what you've agreed is agreeable to you. So understanding exactly where you stand as a business is going to be, it's pivotal for you to be able to make the correct choice. So this business continuity, it's disaster recovery, it's backup and data restoration. So I always had problems with people who knew a lot about an application, but didn't know enough to prevent themselves from making a big mistake. So in those instances, you may have to restore from backup. How many hours of data, how many minutes of data are you okay with losing? What is the worst case scenario? And does your vendor support that from a backup and restoration standpoint? For ongoing monitoring, vulnerability management, and incident response, questions to answer. So if you do have a security incident, if there is some sort of breach that you become aware of, who do you call? Is it a chatbot? Is it an email? Is it a phone number? Understanding what you're going to do and what the escalation path is for each of these is going to be very, very important for you to know. So for getting into business continuity, disaster backup, and data restoration, those are kind of all in the same ballpark. So in the on-premise world, obviously, it's going to be fully managed by your organization. It requires investments in hardware, planning, potentially an offsite backup location, testing, higher risk, full control. Again, it's the same theme. In the SaaS vendor world for backup and disaster recovery, you're probably not going to see a lot of variability here. You may see a little bit some, but by and large, your cloud SaaS and web SaaS vendors are going to have this handled for you. They're going to have potentially automated failover for you, geographic redundancy. You're going to have rapid recovery based on our provider processes. And so you're going to want to make sure that those processes are in alignment with your expectations, but those are largely going to be handled by you. And you may not. The reality is in a lot of these situations, the vendors probably will understand that something's going wrong before you do. So that's something to consider. Your SLAs, right? So what are your SLAs that you would have or you would be expecting? So for me, even with your internal your IT team, there's an unspoken SLA, right? Your expectations from them. You may still even need to reach out to your vendor if you're in an on-premise situation, because if you don't have that subject matter expert in-house, you're going to need to eventually reach out to them for support. So understanding what the SLAs are with your vendors is going to be really important, and also sending what your internal IT teams can commit to from a support standpoint. Certifications as well. So certifications are a big piece of it, whether or not your vendors are SOC 2 compliant. That may or may not be important to you, but it's one less thing for your IT team to worry about from a SaaS vendor perspective. If you are concerned with that, I would still encourage you to also make sure that you examine documents for gaps. So don't rely on your vendors to. They're not going to when you're being audited and you're providing vendor documentation, you're still on the hook if there are gaps in it. So always make sure you've done that homework ahead of time. And the last piece of this is the ongoing monitoring and incident response, which we touched on briefly, but obviously patching, security, paying attention to the latest in threats. It's a lot of work for your IT team to do in addition to managing all the projects. If they have this chops for it, they have the staff for it, fantastic. Cloud SaaS and web SaaS are going to basically take that on for you. So understanding your requirements and who's responsible for the security backup and compliance lets you line up your business priorities to the right deployment model. So that's pretty much what we're going with there. AI, everybody's talking about AI, and it's kind of scary. It's scary from the standpoint of it's moving so fast that we need to make sure that we're thinking about all the things before they become problematic. So really the most important thing you as a company can do prior to making a choice here is to understand what is your organization's AI policy, and is it a clear AI policy? Do you want your vendor to leverage or access your QMS data for AI at all? I don't. That's a question for you to answer. Are the AI tools closed? Meaning, are they hosted? Are they hosted internally, not shared with the rest of the world, or is it open? Is it open model? Is it a Chat GPT? Does corporate need to approve your use cases? Do the native AI capabilities, if any, meet your privacy, data governance, and policy requirements? So these are all really important questions to understand, and you may not know the answer, or maybe you already do. But one of the things that you want to think about is if you already have an LLM or an AI internal to yourself that you use and it's already closed, do you have a use case? So I think the most important thing to do is consider, do I have an AI use case for an integration with an LLM? And one example potentially would be to monitor SOPs and policies when they going out of compliance, right? Or you may want to do some analysis on them. Your question might be, does my vendor support that? I don't know. You have to basically kind of do that research. The most important thing to go to your vendor with is a use case and understanding how they would go about implementing it. So in on-prem, you're going to have the ability to have, an LLM that you guys have closed off, that you can potentially do an integration with. But you're going to have to support that fully. So you can have strict control over the AI adoption, the data governance, all the policies, approvals, and integrations are all going to be managed internally. So it offers you the highest privacy and oversight, but typically it's going to mean slower access to the new AI features, which is probably a reasonable trade-off. Now, cloud SaaS is going to bring rapid access and standardized vendor management AI with robust governance tools for privacy and compliance. However, the use case may be a total miss, right? Because it's going to be built into the application most likely. So if it's not particularly going to help you, then you never know. That's why I said the most important thing is to really understand what your use cases are. And then the web SaaS model, again, it's kind of the same vein as integrations. There's going to be a little bit more flexibility there to figure out, okay, this is my use case. This would be really valuable to me. Can I work with my vendor to come up with a cool, creative solution here? And again, this has other impacts too in terms of validation efforts. If this is a customized process, what are the considerations there? But you have that flexibility to what I call make the shoe fit a little bit better in a web SaaS model. So when you really understand both your business's appetite for AI and how you plan to manage risks, plus the way you're actually going to use these within the tools, you're in the best position to make a smart, confident choice. Last but not last, second to last, but also not least, compliance roles and responsibilities by deployment model. So compliance, yes, compliance and validation. On-prem has always been the key, right? So your full compliance responsibility is your organization's responsibility. Your IT and QA teams have to generate, update, and maintain all of the validation documentation like PIQs, PDSs, IQs, all of that fun stuff. And periodic reviews, the audit support, SOP development, backup strategies, compliance reporting, they're all handled in-house. It's a lot of work. And if you're a large company with a large IT team, you probably have a CSV, computer systems validation team, setting up all of these roadblocks for you so that you can't get your project done in 2026. It's going to have to wait until 2027. Not uncommon. Small companies can be a lot more agile, but they don't have the strict process. So it's definitely a trade-off there. So on-premise is going to succeed really, really well in the validation efforts, but also going to make people upset because the timelines are so blown way out of proportion. Cloud SaaS is a great option, right? Because vendors typically are going to provide you a lot of that compliance documentation. They're going to give you the PIQs and PDSs and the IQs and all of the validation audit reporting. They're going to maintain the infrastructure. They're going to help and respond to audits for you, not all, for you, but with you, including change controls, periodic reviews, and all that responsibility is going to lie with your relationship and the vendor. So the customer's main job, you in this is to really review and approve and retain these records, and make sure that it matches your organization's compliance needs. So this document's own configuration of the system, part of its compliance story. So really understanding how the client's paperwork is helping you stay in compliance, really. So it's a tool to be used, and it definitely saves a lot of time. Web SaaS is kind of a lot of the same things. You're not going to see it too much in the way of variance here. There may be some supplementing you're going to have to do in the web SaaS model versus a cloud SaaS model, specifically around things like a custom integration. So you may have some additional validation needs that you may need to do in that particular world, which will be on your plate and not the vendor's plate, but that's a negotiation. Amy made it seem in the beginning that SaaS in general, specifically web SaaS, I feel like cloud SaaS, the standard model is the way you understand it is pretty regimented. However, web SaaS is probably quite a spectrum of what actually is vendors are willing to support. So what I would say is when you're in the web SaaS model, the lot is able to be negotiated. And in fact, a lot of them will actually be supplement to different price points. So it's things to consider there. One consideration I would definitely want to not caution, but just be aware of. There's actually a few things. One is data residency, right? So you need to check where your data will physically be stored. Some regulations require that data stay within a certain region, like the US or EU. And you're going to want to ask your vendor exactly which country your region is going to be kept in. So if you have those requirements, make sure you understand what servers you're getting stuck on. Another thing is cloud region compliance. Not all vendor data centers are created equal. I used Bob's discount already, so I'll use it again. chances are that Bob's Discount Cloud Hosting will not meet the same regulatory standards as AWS or Azure. So you're going to want to confirm the specific data center or cloud region if you also have those requirements. And lastly, one thing that kind of gets missed is that in a compliance and validation, if you're validated industry, you're going to be required as the user of an application, as the user of a platform. You still on the hook for user requirement specifications and platform requirement specifications. So, and that can often get overlooked. There's some instances where you can leverage your vendor for boilerplate documentation regarding a URS and a PRS document. However, it's important to know that that is still going to come up as an issue for you that may not be given to you by default. So make sure you understand that you still have those requirements when you start using a QMS that's being hosted in the cloud. Likewise, you need the URS and PRS if it's on-prem, but most likely you've already got that handled. So the compliance rules shift depending upon your deployment model. On-premise puts full responsibility on your team. Cloud SaaS leans on the vendor, but still needs customer oversight. And web SaaS will tend to split duties, specifically if you're adding in some custom implementations. So no matter the model, check where your data is stored, clarify contract details, make sure your documentation responsibilities are clear, make sure you've got a URS and a platform requirement specification so compliance gaps don't catch you off guard. And last, support. Support is probably one of the most important things that you can really consider, because if you are unhappy with your relationship with your vendor, it's the first thing that's going to cause you to leave. So when you're considering your support, you really want to understand what you require. What kind of support response times and resolution guarantees do we require as a business? Who will be responsible for providing support? Our team, is it the vendor, or is it a mix of the two? And what hours of coverage do we actually get? How do we want feature requests and bug fixes to be handled and communicated both now and as we scale? Will we need support for custom integrations, and who will be accountable for maintaining them? What process do we expect for handling urgent issues and escalations? And does it need to change depending upon the deployment model we select? I mean, when you're considering on-premise, your internal is all internal. It's potentially third-party support. It really is going to depend on your availability of IT resources. And this also circles back to, how are you classifying your QMS, and is there agreement between you and the IT team on how important your QMS is? So if you guys don't agree, the chances are that your request could be sitting for a while, and that may or may not be okay with you. And as I mentioned earlier, there is no necessarily a vendor SLA in an on-premise environment. If you may have to use your internal support teams or an internal SME to first try to resolve the issue, and then you may be subject to just waiting in email for a response from the vendor. So it's something to understand exactly what your support model with the vendor is going to look like in that on-premise model. So in cloud SaaS, it's usually going to be vendor managed support. It's probably going to be 24/7. Don't know if it's going to be an actual support person or it's going to be a chatbot. Understanding exactly what your users are going to want, what's going to keep them happy, is extremely important. And use reviews. Go online, look for reviews on your vendors to see what people are saying about the support. It's an incredibly valuable tool. Support is the one thing, people don't go and brag and do 5-star reviews. Generally, most of the time they're going to go out there and give 1-star reviews. So you're going to be able to see pretty quickly the number of 1-star reviews and what people's satisfaction are with certain vendors. So it's definitely important to gather, to understand exactly what you're getting. And for web SaaS, the only real difference you're going to see there is obviously if there's a shared support model. And that really depends on the way that you've done your infrastructure. Usually web SaaS and cloud SaaS are going to be on top of it from that support perspective. But it all depends on the nature of the business, right? And the nature of the issue that you're experiencing. So outages will be handled very severely and quickly. But that email about that thing that didn't work right that one time, you don't know what you're going to get for that. So it's really important to understand what the support model is, what your expectation should be in terms of response time based on the issue severity. And then maybe lastly, are there any subscription tier models that you could buy up into potentially? So there's things to consider there. So when deciding which deployment model to go with, it helps to think about how support will actually work day to day. On-prem systems will primarily rely on your own staff, and all support processes and timelines are managed internally. Cloud SaaS means support comes from the vendor under a formal SLA, including help desk hours and onboarding. So with web SaaS, responsibility is generally shared, with vendors covering the infrastructure fully and varying percentages depending upon the particulars of the QMS engagement. Understanding these differences will help line up your support expectations with your business needs. And with support covered, it's time to look at costs. So I'll hand it off to Amy to dig into the financials.
Thanks, Chad. It is my least favorite thing to talk about. But let me just say, great job, Chad. I think I've heard him talk more in the last 30 minutes than I have in the last month because I tend to do a lot of the talking. I just have a lot to say. So financial considerations, we definitely have a lot to say about that. It's certainly an obvious driver of what vendors make your shortlist, what features and modules you can afford to adopt now or even in the future. We find it's the first question people ask us. And we don't want them to ask that question first. We want them to talk about what are their user requirements, their functional requirements, their deployment model requirements, all of that, because that's really what should drive what option that you pick. I want to talk about costs, not just about the sticker price. We're not going to dive into how much each of these models cost and really the key differences, but what are the drivers behind them so that you consider the overall cost, not just what the vendor and the application is going to charge you for these different models. So the cost that you need to think about for on-premise, there's the initial hardware investment. This might be virtual servers, physical servers, a subscription fee for a cloud-based service. You're going to pay some initial IT, quality, consumer software validation, and potentially other staffing time, which is often a sunk cost, but certainly has a price tag associated with it. You're going to pay for ancillary software costs. This is going to be virus and threat detection, Microsoft Office, Microsoft SQL Server, or other database application. You're going to pay for backups and storage. And that's really just to name a few. There's a long list of applications that will go into installing the hardware and then putting a QMS on top of it. Then there's the ongoing costs of IT staff to support the hardware, to upgrade the QMS, and the help desk for the QMS itself. That might also be a sunk cost by your business. You have an IT staff, they're designated to supporting all applications, but it is something to be considered depending upon the complexity, the number of users of your QMS, and the burden that it places on that team. Now, large companies will also have economies of scale, not in addition to having larger IT teams that are already doing the job of application support. So their buying power for things like architecture and software is greater than that of small companies. Think of your Azure servers. If you have thousands of them, you may get an economies of scale rather than a small company. Another reason why the small companies are apt to go SaaS, they don't have that buying power. So everything that they buy, that they install behind the firewall, is going to cost them more than if they were, say, a large pharmaceutical institution. Now, often on-premise is a higher initial investment, which is the cost of the hardware, particularly if it's physical, but it's going to be lower over time. Why is that? Historically, on-premise software was a purchase price plus maintenance. However, this is no longer a model offered by many vendors in the space. Most vendors nowadays for on-premise have a subscription model, which is very much in alignment with SaaS. So you pay annually to be able to have access to utilize the software. If you do not, your license keys are apt to expire. And that's just because there is a higher cost of operating to do business with on-premise customers that it is rarely going to be a buy it and simply maintain it. Now, SaaS may have higher annual fees, even compared to on-premise subscription. Well, why is that? This is because, as you can see, everything that Chad talked about, the vendor bears the burden of supporting the entire platform itself. So this is your virus and threat detection. It's all those third-party software applications. It's wherever the data is physically hosted. It's the teams to support all that. So the human resources, all of that goes into what the vendor pays for SaaS. So they may charge more because their costs are simply higher. That's really going to vary as well, cloud-based or web-based. Cloud-based is less architecture, less instances of all those extra applications. Web-based is going to be significantly more, and that's going to depend upon if it is a multi-server or single server installation, and you should talk to your vendor about those costs and what you're getting for those particular costs. Now, finally, some other drivers of the cost, really, whether they are on-premise or SaaS, as you can see here by the bottom line, is your level of support. Some vendors may charge a premium for live or elevated support. So if you don't want chatbots, you don't want help portals, you don't want offshore, you want live people to answer the phone outside of necessarily even just business hours. If you want the vendor to do things that you could do yourself, kind of a managed services scenario, that's also going to drive your costs. Hardware and security needs. Do you need more backups, more physical space, a higher level of responsiveness in the software and performance, where you may need multiple servers, load balancers, other things of that nature? That's going to cost more, whether it's on-prem or it's in a SaaS model. And then potentially compliance overhead. So compliance overhead by your vendors is just simply a facet. I don't know of any vendors that offer QMSs that do not offer compliance options. So options for folks that are FDA regulated and need that plethora of extra oversight and extra paperwork that Chad mentioned. When you have compliance overhead, you need quality teams and manage your software development lifecycle in a very rigid way. You have to develop a lot of specific paperwork with evidence about your particular software. You need experts on staff to be able to respond to security and quality audits by our customers. So there's a certain cost of doing business that QMS vendors need to offer. If you have a vendor and they are not priced in alignment with similar vendors, they may not have the expertise and the resources in those particular areas. So if you are regulated and you do need to audit your vendor and you do need to have all that documentation, just make sure they have the right expertise and that they've been doing it for a long time, because it's really important to your business that you choose a vendor that has all of that should you ever get audited and need to leverage any of their documentation. Okay, that wraps up 8 of the key considerations and criteria for when selecting which hosting model is best for you. I want to jump into just a couple simple case studies. So the first case study is a large consumer health and pharmaceutical company. No surprise here, they chose on-premise. Why did they choose on-premise though? So to kind of wrap up some of those specific considerations. Validation and FDA CFR Part 11 compliance. They wanted to do it themselves. They had teams of people. They believed that their way was exactly the perfect way, because there's a lot of interpretation on how to interpret some of the regulations. They wanted to have an ERP integration. They wanted to integrate with Oracle-based SAP application. They had the in-house resources to make those connections because they've done it several times with other applications. They also wanted a reporting warehouse where they could integrate, store all the central data, and then put their own business intelligence tools on top of it, where they mine data from both the QMS about specifications, non-conformances, training, and then aggregated that with data from their SAP and from other systems. They wanted to host on their own Azure architecture. They had those economies of scale. They're a global company. It made sense to them not to offset that cost with SaaS charges. They required specific architecture where they not only needed one environment or recommended 2, they needed 4. A development to test new functionality, new releases, a user acceptance testing environment for formal documentation and evidence, a pre-production environment, which has an architecture that mimicked production, and then a final production environment. So to have that didn't make sense to pay a vendor for all of that. They wanted to host it themselves. And then a traditional on-premise mindset of regulated industries that we see is very, very common. Conversely, a mid-sized plastics manufacturer, a younger company, they've been around about 10 years or so, they chose SaaS. The reasons why they chose SaaS: speed of deployment. They had no customizations, no integrations. They wanted to get up and running quickly. They'd had a bad audit from one of their customers, and they needed to get ready to prepare for ISO 9001 certification. They need the system fast. So SaaS makes the most sense. They have a lower IT burden. They don't have a big team of IT staff. They would rather outsource the platform hosting and management of everything to the SaaS vendor. They're also early adopters. They want access to the latest features immediately. They don't want to upgrade once a year. They want to take every single release as it becomes available. They find that training is really easy for their team because it is not a substantial size team. And lastly, they had some support for some regional offices and remote staff. They don't have VPN requirements for people to get into the system. They just need to use single sign-on and have people all over the place. So therefore, they didn't want to manage folks getting inside the firewall. It made more sense just to host it externally with the SaaS provider. One last topic. So we've smuggled in a lot of key considerations and hundreds of questions today. The final thing that I want you to think about are really just some specific business requirements, because your use case may not be one of those two examples. It's some meld in between of those particular use cases. So we've pulled out just a handful of business criteria, characteristics, needs, whatever you want to call it, and listed them, and then kind of listed where they are best fits for the deployment model. So the first one is really in-house compliance knowledge. Whether you have people in-house or not, all three options are good for you. Your CSV team probably has some applications that can only be SaaS and some that have the option. So therefore, they are familiar with the documentation that is provided by the vendor. They will assess as the vendor documentation suitable for their requirements and up to snuff, so to say. So it doesn't really matter what option that you choose. Next one might be scalability. So see scalability, do you have thousands of users, tens of thousands of records, records created every second because you're using your QMS for as much as you can possibly use it for? On-premise and web-based SaaS are going to have equivalent scalability. You could always throw more hardware at an application. However, it just is, I put a little caution mark here for cloud-based SaaS. You need to check with your vendor. Does your vendor have similar experience with significant size implementations? And it really just is a caution, because in theory, it is one instance of an application with tens or hundreds or thousands of customers in there. If you now come in and you have an installation that's the equivalent to dozens or hundreds of customers in itself, can it handle that? So it's just a conversation that you need to have. And then next one would be the lowest IT lift, kind of an obvious one, but on-premise would be the highest IT lift. And it doesn't matter really which SaaS option you choose, there's going to be a substantially lower IT lift. As little as you need your validation people, which may be in the IT team, to oversee the paperwork, and then you need them to give you 2 lines of code to implement your SSO. That may be as little as IT lift as you need, regardless of which SaaS implementation. I won't go through all of these. We'll definitely have this PowerPoint as a handout. So recap. Did we give you the answer of what you should choose? Absolutely not. We can't tell you what your business requirements are. And as Chad went through, hundreds of questions that you need to ask yourself and make sure that you align your selection with both what your business users need, your quality team needs. We didn't even start talking about regulatory and other adjacent teams, production teams, operations managers, et cetera. And then certainly the requirements of your business from an IT perspective. And then lastly, a cost perspective. You have to look at everything that we weighed today and decide what option is best for you. And maybe there's 1 or 2 of the 3 models that are perfectly suitable. Maybe they're ranked, and then cost comes into play. But lots of considerations to make. Just to recap, we've got those 8 key criteria there that Chad covered in depth. Now, last final thought. Given the considerations that we presented today in your current situation, remember I had told you to think about what your current situation is. If you have no system today, what makes the most sense for you today? To lean towards SaaS, and if so, which SaaS model? Do you need, do you not want to upgrade with every single upgrade? Do you have customizations that you want to make, not just take the software out of the box? Maybe that's a web-based model. Do you not? Maybe it's a cloud-based model. Do you need on-premise because you're highly regulated and have a team and that's what IT is saying? Fine, you can send them this presentation and it may get you nowhere, and on-premise is still your most viable solution. If you have a QMS, what kind do you have? And did we really just give you some food for thought today? Are you considering that next time you need a solution, or if you're not happy with your current solution from a requirements and feature service perspective and you're looking for a new option, did this give you some ideas on what you need to consider when you go out to market. We hope that it did, and that was the point of today, is to educate you and inform you about the different options and the questions that you really should be collaborating with your team on. Okay, I think Miss Christine is going to come on and open it up for questions.
Yes, thank you, Amy and Chad. That was a lot of information, a lot of good stuff to think about. We do have some questions from the chat. The first one is, can we start with an on-premise system and then change to SaaS down the line?
Great question. I'll take that one. The answer is yes. And we actually have customers that were on-premise for a long time switching to SaaS. If it is web-based SaaS, that is super easy. It's kind of a lift and shift. It's like taking the data and moving it to new hardware internally, which sometimes happens, or moving it into new hardware in your vendor's cloud. It's really just a lift and shift of the application, the content, and the database, moving it over. You probably have to upgrade when you do that, because nobody wants to be putting someone in a new SaaS environment on an ancient version of the software. It's going to be trickier if your vendor is cloud-based, because if it's cloud-based, you will then be commingled. It's not a lift and shift. However, your vendors will have migration capabilities, whether they're coming from their own application or coming from some other third party's application or legacy on-premise homegrown solutions. So talk to your vendor. Short answer is yes. How complicated it might be will definitely depend on the SaaS model.
Awesome, thank you. Our next one is, we have employees who can only access applications via VPN if they're outside of the building, but we'd also like suppliers to access our system. So what is the easiest way to do that? And can we use any deployment option?
I'll give that question to Chad.
Yeah, sure. So you're going to want to see what your capabilities are for getting when you're talking about outside the building, non-local type of access. The VPN methodology, while you can make it work, you can have VPNs from multiple locations, you can set all that up. It's a lot to manage, it's a lot to work with. If you have the ability to switch over to a single sign-on type of authentication methodology, that is ideal. So you can even support that in an on-prem world as well. They're just usually a lot more rigor and a lot more IT involvement that's going to need to take place. The more intuitive answer to your question would be to go into a SaaS model in that world. If your authentication easiest methodology would be to do a single sign-on where everybody has the same methodology, you all log into the same application, the same instructions, the same training, the same place to go for onboarding, the same place to go to basically support requests regarding I can't log into my account. That's probably going to make the most sense longer term when you have that. So my recommendation would be to go with an SSO solution, and probably within a SaaS model would be the most well-oiled machine, so to speak.
Thank you, Chad. And one last question. As it relates to compliance requirements, we are ISO 9001, and I'm not familiar with the acronyms PDS, PIQ, or IQ. Should I be?
Well, you're absolutely going to want to familiarize yourself with, if you're subject to those regulations, you're going to want to make sure you understand what each of those documentations are going to mean, specifically if that is part of your responsibility. So and I think you said PDS, PIQ. So PDS is your platform design specification. Your PIQ is your platform installation qualification.
IQ.
Your installation qualification. Your installation qualification is going to be regards to your specific application that's getting installed on the server. So your QMS. So the two of the documents are essentially the ones that are associated with your platform. And I want to bring up to you mentioned you did not necessarily understand those. Again, the user requirement specification is a very important one, and also the requirement specification for your platform. You're going to need to make sure you understand you have those. And it's really an exercise more so than it is a formality. So for your team, so understanding your user requirements, what is the system supposed to do, is going to be a paramount really should be having those meetings as a part of the requirements gatherings before you submit your request, your RFP to your vendors, to understand exactly what they're capable of, and that the solution that they're going to offer you is going to meet the requirements of the business.
I'll just jump in there and just add that if you don't know what those are and you're a quality professional, you are not likely regulated by the FDA. So those acronyms are specific to FDA, computer software validation, which we talked a lot about today. It tends to be the most stringent requirement when it comes to assessment of software that you decide to implement into your business. So a lot of other regulations like the European Union, Health Canada, a lot of our customers that are in pharmaceutical, healthcare, med device follow those FDA regulations and need all that documentation, even if they do not sell their products in the US, because it is a gold standard for regulated businesses. If you are not regulated, you do not make things that are for human consumption, so to say, then you're in a traditional manufacturing, let's say you're a plastics manufacturer, you're a raw component manufacturer, in your ISO 9001 compliant, you do not need all that documentation, but chances are your vendor is still going to complete some portion of it on your behalf, because they do have a mixture of customers that are regulated and are not. So it's just making sure that the vendors are doing what they say they're supposed to be doing and having a lot of rigidity around their processes. So you get to benefit from it, but you don't need to actually see or fill out that documentation if you're not regulated by the FDA.
Great. I do not see any other questions, so I think we can wrap up here. Thank you again to Amy and Chad, who are fantastic presenters today, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We'd ask that you be on the lookout for a follow-up email. It's going to go out to all of our attendees who joined us today, and we would ask that you please share that with your colleagues or anyone else that you feel would benefit from today's webinar. So thank you all so much again, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.